In the first message, we were looking at courage. And this message balanced that with caution. I think sometimes we forget about the need to be cautious, and I think that is perhaps one of the areas for which true spiritual maturity begins, when we realize that we need to be cautious. You know, we think about this in the terms of as our age. There are individuals that are young, vibrant, jumping out there in the middle of something, and then all of a sudden, hey, I need help, I need help. Sometimes you may feel that way spiritually. You feel the courage to go forward and conquer, and you get in the middle of a terrible situation, and then you're driven to your knees and asking God, can you bail me out here? I think my mouth overstated what I can do here. And sometimes he may say, yeah, I'll help you out. And sometimes he's like, you know what? I think you need to learn a lesson here. You need to go through a few things to keep that mouth in check for writing checks that you can't back up, spiritually speaking. So I think that is something for us to consider. You know, I know my wife and I some time ago were watching a show called Zelda. And Zelda, as one of the relatives, are here with us today. Beth Burleson, family member. And Zelda was, you know, one of those individuals that had her own unique lifestyle, but she has an intersection with F. Scott Fitzgerald in the book The Great Gatsby, which I think probably many of you, if you haven't read the book, I haven't read the book, but I have seen several movies, and that's been made over multiple times. An interesting movie, a crazy movie. And it was in the 1920s, and that period of time in our society did not get its name just because of all the lack of activity. They called it the Roaring Twenties for a reason. I wasn't there before my time, but you know, there are some historical context given to it in that story. And in that story of The Great Gatsby, there was a tremendous amount of careless activity. In fact, there's an excerpt from the book, and I'll just read it here. It says, they were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things, creatures, and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. I think if you have oftentimes been a part of raising teenage children, you probably, on one level or another, can relate to this statement here. Hopefully it's not been a disastrous situation, but without a doubt, they can be quite careless. They can make some big messes and come back to the parents and ask them to help them out. Sometimes we can clean up messes. Sometimes they have to face the music, so to speak. They have to go through, in some extreme cases, the things that they put themselves into. And it can result in decisions made that are very, very detrimental to the happiness of their physical life as well. So we see that, and we can possibly juxtapose that to our own lives from time to time. How many times has Jesus Christ or the Father cleaned up our mess that we made? How many times have we gone out there and been reckless and careless in boldness, in courageousness, and then made a mess of things, and then went back with their spiritual tails between our legs and said, can you help me out here? And I think that is something you and I need to be careful with, because being careless is not unique to us. It's not unique to the 1920s. It's been in the Bible for many, many eras of time. You know, from a biblical context, carelessness references obviously a lack of attention to detail, diligence, a lack of concern in the right areas, whether it was spiritual, whether it was moral or practical. I mean, we have the book of Judges that has a lot of issues there. And of course, what comes to my mind in some cases immediately out of the gate is Samson himself. You talk about reckless activity and a reckless lifestyle from a person that God used. So we can be just as reckless. hopefully not in the same ways. We learn from other people's mistakes and don't make them ourselves, but we make enough mistakes on our own that we need to learn from too. And that's just one example. There are many in Scripture, whether it's Esau, whether it's Cain, whether it's Adam and Eve. From the very beginning, there's a lot of reckless activity that's going on in the human world and in our own lives, even when God's present. Now, in Scripture, there's these examples, and we are told and given warnings against having a reckless, bold attitude in the wrong way. Courage and boldness can, if not done correctly, be a way for which we end up becoming reckless and careless, and as a result of that, go down paths that God never intended to be gone down by us. The Bible gives a lot of consequences for these things. Think of the blessings and curses chapter that we reference. They were told, if you do this, this is going to happen. If you do this, that's going to happen. There are consequences for actions. God gives us the opportunity to make choices. But what we don't have is we don't have the option to not experience the consequences of our choices. You have the freedom to make the choice. You do not have the freedom to not get outside of the consequences of your choices. And that's something for you and for me to consider and keep in mind. Being careless, as I have here, in any area of life is a bit of a gamble with disaster. As you're turning over to Proverbs 14, I remember years ago, right after the economic issues that our country went through in 2008 and 2009, for the first time in my life, I engaged a financial advisor. And I sat down with him and I said, listen, man, I said, I'm looking at my funds here in my 401k and this is bleeding like crazy. And he was like, well, let me ask you a question, Neal. He said, I don't know you that well, but he said, what level of tolerance do you have for risk? And I said, at this moment, with my money, 0. So, when we think about it, circumstances and time can impact us in our level. Personally, Las Vegas and the glitz and glamour does not a thing for me. Gambling is not a problem for me. I have absolutely 0 interest in putting my money out, even for a lottery. But that's just me personally. I'm kind of a low-risk person. We got Ben here, an insurance person. I'm pretty sure when it comes on the risk scale, he's probably way down there too. And he wants every one of his customers to be low on the risk scale. Because the higher the risk, yes, the greater the reward, but also the greater the catastrophe if you're not careful. Being bold spiritually can bring you a lot of things, but you better do it correctly and cautiously, or it can bring a lot of disaster. In Proverbs chapter 14, beginning in verse 15, it says, the naive. Some translations use the word simple, but the real meaning of the Hebrew is the naive, meaning the person not thinking through this, believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. Sensible, naive, believing everything, thinking and considering what you're doing. A wise man is cautious and turns away from evil, but a foolish is arrogant and careless. Those are the consequences of the choices we make. Proverbs chapter 22, just a few pages over in my Bible, in verse 3, it says, the prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive goes on and is punished for it. Now, I think, we've all heard that story about, looking both ways before you leap. Be careful with what you do. Think through your actions. Make sure that if you do A, know that someone may do B, and then think through what C is going to be. Think through what you're doing. Don't just jump out there. Spiritually speaking, sometimes we're like, well, this is totally against being bold. This says, if you see danger, hide yourself. I'd say that's pretty much common sense. Don't stick your neck out there to have it chopped off. Be careful. Think through your consequences. Do you think that perhaps Joseph of Arimathea had to think through the consequences of what he was about to do. He waited for the right time to do it. He wasn't in the middle, apparently, trying to stop God's plan, because that was the reason why Jesus came into that hour. So he didn't try to stop the council from doing what they were doing. Now, you can say this because he didn't have the courage, perhaps, but he waited, and when the right time came, then he had the courage to do what he needed to do. That, I think, is being courageous and cautious at the right times. That, I think, is an example of what you should have and what I should have. You know, Ben Franklin, very famous statement, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We think of that, and we've given that advice probably to our children over the course of time, and we think of that, we even think of that when disease-related issues. You know, being cautious, being careful, not to put yourself out there to get some kind of disease, you know, is worth way more than having to go through the prevention later, and the cure, rather, I should say, the prevention. You know, you think about it with lifestyles. You know, try to teach your children to say, hey, don't get out there and be promiscuous. Don't do all that other stuff. You can scare them straight with all the kinds of venereal diseases and sexually transmitted diseases and things like that. You hope and pray that you give them the information. You tell them, don't do this, all the reasons why. You know, it's the prevention of this is going to be a lot better than having to go through the cure for this activity. And that's just one area. But what about spiritually speaking? I think from a spiritual perspective, we need to heed the same advice. You know, when we think about just life in general, be careful with the preferences and choices you make. And that advice is across the spectrum of life, not just spiritually speaking, not just physically speaking. That's with your finances. That's with every aspect of every part of your life. We used to have a president in our country, and he was called the compartmentalized president. He was this way in that circumstance and this way in that circumstance. He compartmentalized his life. And you think about that, the problem with that issue, I should say, was that he was different based on what the circumstances were. He wasn't consistently the same type of person. From a spiritual standpoint, you and I need to be consistent with God's choices, not our own. Careful people, they typically gather enough information to make the best choice and then act. Just like we read here in Proverbs, the prudent person sees evil and then acts. The prudent person doesn't, when they see the evil, say, well, I'm just going to step out here and God's going to protect me. What did Satan try to do with Jesus Christ? Well, God said he would protect you. Just jump off this building. And your parents probably told you, just because someone tells you to jump off the roof, are you going to jump off the roof? You know, again, you weigh everything out, and you're like, this is not a good thing. I'm not doing this. And, of course, Jesus didn't fall for Satan's ploy either. Being a careful person is not taking unnecessary chances, putting yourself in unnecessary damage or bad situations. I use the example when I met with this financial advisor, and I've been meeting with him for years now. But when I told him that, I mean, no matter where you invest your money, there's a little bit of risk, no matter what. But the point of it is I don't want to make unnecessary risks. There was a risk for you to come to church today, out there on that road. You have no idea what somebody else is on when they're driving. There could be some drunk person even this early in the morning. Person on some drugs. You have no idea the person beside you. Makes you a little cautious to blow your horn at somebody because you don't know what they're going to do. They may pull out a gun nowadays. That's happened here in Alabama before. You have to be cautious and careful and weigh out the options. You made a risk of even getting out of the bed this morning. You made a risk if you decided to stay in the bed too. So you're not going to get around from all risks, but you don't want to do unnecessary things that's going to cause problems. And, you think about it, that's true in all forms of life, but it's also true, spiritually speaking, for us to do. Being careful is a management tool, and we use it to control our attitude, our words, and how we come across to other people. Some of us are probably a little more abrasive in nature. Some of us are probably a little more docile in nature. It just depends on personal preferences and personal, attitudes that we have that are innate within us. But just because we have a proclivity to be one way or the other doesn't mean that we shouldn't be the opposite of what comes innately to us when circumstances arise. We need to manage ourselves in the right way. Be careful with ourselves. Know that you, through self-awareness, that I have a short fuse. Well, then manage that short fuse. Know that you need to zip it sometimes. Bite your tongue. And sometimes you know that there may be a proclivity to not do something or say something when it needs to be said. Manage yourself for what's needed at the time. It's important. Again, at times of economic recessions, from a fiscal perspective, you have people, and maybe that's happening right now, who have emotions associated to the fear of doing business. Emotionally, they don't know what's going to happen. Good example, tariffs. This whole discussion of tariffs came up, and I don't know who you listen to. I listen to Bloomberg radio a lot, and they have people come in back and forth on both sides. When that first came out, we're all going under now. And then others were like, oh no, there's billions of dollars being created. And then others are saying, well, I still got these billions of dollars you say are out there, but I'm having a hard time paying for a dozen eggs. The gamut is out there. But, there are organizations that will fund initiatives based on emotions and fear. They're not looking at all the indicators and the information. They're reacting instead of proactively viewing and looking at all the things out there. They're not believing everything they hear, as we saw here, naively. And they're not just accepting whatever someone says and jumping forward. They're weighing out all their choices, getting the information, and then making the best choices. Now, we can fall into a common practice in business called paralysis through analysis. You never do anything because all you're doing is collecting data. I used to work for a man who used to tell me at times, because I was somewhat nervous because he was very volatile, and I would have to go give him some bad news from time to time about the organization that I was managing. And I would make sure we'd walk out on the balcony, and he was a chain smoker. And we'd get out there, and his face would get so angry and so red, and I would start backing away from the balcony because I'm like, he may lose his temper, and I'd go flying over this balcony. And I told him about that when he retired, and he just laughed. He says, no, man, I love you, man. I wouldn't ever do that to you. I'm like, well, you could have fooled me. There were some times that I thought I was going to grow some wings or something. But, I would sit there, and I would take this information, and because he was all about facts and data. He said, come to me with facts and data. I don't care about emotions. Facts and data, facts and data. And I would sit there, and I'd have all this analysis, and I would sit on something and say, well, I'm going to give it another day. And you become paralyzed. So we have to analyze, but don't be paralyzed by the analyzation as well. If you think about it, being cautious is not necessarily the opposite of boldness. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, we see a very commonly referred to statement that Jesus made. He said, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. I'm sending you out. I'm setting a expectation for you of the circumstances you're going into. A sheep in the middle of wolves is pretty bad. It's a bad situation, so to speak. But he says, so be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. Man, that is a balancing act. Don't be naive. Be cautious. Be careful. Do it right. Do it with the right heart. Don't do it with malice and deceit. Be careful. Be shrewd in what you do. Weigh out all the alternatives. Weigh out your actions about what you're about to do because you're in a hostile environment. Remember, you are a sheep in the middle of wolves that want to tear you apart. Be careful. Be cautious. Is that the opposite of being bold? Let's turn over to Romans chapter 16. You know, Romans chapter 16 gives us another perspective. Here we see, speaking specifically to the church at Rome in verse 19, Paul says, "For the report of your obedience has reached to all. Therefore I am rejoicing over you, but I want you to be wise in what is good, innocent in what is evil." You know, being good's just not enough. Be wise in good. I think, my opinion, that is an effectual doer of the law that James referenced. Not just a doer, but wise, able to navigate with good, and be innocent or let evil be absent from what you're doing. You know, we think of shrewdness, or at least I think of shrewdness, oftentimes as being manipulative. But Jesus even has a parable that the world around is more shrewd than the children of God. And he's encouraging the children of God, the disciples of Jesus Christ, step up your game with shrewdness. Be careful. Don't just jump out there. Don't be thinking that you're just going to jump out there and expect yourself to be protected all the time because you're in an evil environment. I think caution requires discernment. Let's turn over to Proverbs chapter 3. We think about Proverbs, and I think I've referenced this passage one time in the past, but there's some important lessons for us to learn here in Proverbs 3. And verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Do not lean to your own understanding." I think many people have probably in some form or another been able to recite that. Just because it's words, that's like a dictionary meaning. A real meaning is taking that and then being as shrewd as a serpent and innocent as a dove. Being wise in the good and innocent in the evil. Goes on to say in verse 6, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will put your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from your evil. It will be healing to your body." You know, you're free to make choices, but you're not free from the consequences of the choices you make. "And refreshing to your bones. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all of your produce, so that your barn will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine." You know, not only is this physical in our wealth, we don't just hoard it. We don't take the advice of the parable of the foolish individual who built bigger barns and then ended up having his life taken from him that night. It's not about the physical, although the physical plays into our character, but it's also building up barns of plenty relative to spiritual life and the way we live our spiritual life. Verse 11, "My son, do not reject the discipline of your Lord or loathe his reproof. For whom the Lord he loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son whom he delights. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding." So wisdom and understanding are two different things. Actually, if you look at the Hebrew, the word wisdom is the skill. The word understanding is the discernment. The skill to navigate the knowledge that God gives us, and then to discern when to be cautious and when to be bold. Being bold is not enough. Being bold can get you killed. Being bold can result in you not being an effectual doer any longer if you don't have the right caution. It's a balancing act. He goes on to say, "For her profit," speaking of wisdom and understanding, "is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold." In other words, it transcends anything in this physical life. Let's go to chapter 16 in Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 25. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. How many times, spiritually speaking, have you felt emboldened to make a statement to somebody and then realized, yeah, it seemed right, but I didn't ask for God, I didn't wait for God, and found out that, man, I just killed a friendship. I killed a relationship here. Being too bold, not being cautious in the right way. Chapter 19 of Proverbs, chapter 19 and verse 3. It says, also, it is not good for a person to be without knowledge. You know, it's not good to act without properly discerning what's around you and the circumstances before opening your mouth. He goes on to say, he who hurries his footsteps errs. Trying to do something out of the order that God wants it done in can result in error, and we're the ones causing it. We're the ones causing it. Let's turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2. Solomon, the wisest man allegedly on earth until Jesus Christ came here on earth, received his wisdom, no doubt, from Jesus Christ, the God of the Old Testament. But he says here in verse 2, do not be hasty in words or impulsive in your thoughts to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth, therefore let your words be few. Oh, that we could all understand what that really means and do it effectively, efficiently. Let's turn over to Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Without a doubt, having that type of ability to discern will definitely keep us out of problems. We also think that if we permit unrestrained passion, and we know we have to have a certain amount of passion, without a doubt, to motivate, to keep us moving, to move in the right directions, to move and do something. We have to have a certain amount of passion. But unrestrained boldness, unrestrained courage can direct us in the wrong direction. I think all of us are very familiar with the example, a good example, of boldness in the right direction with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 1. Like we all have seen that story, and we understand that these three individuals stood up to the pressure that was put on them in their physical world they lived in by the governmental authority to worship a false god. And they chose to not do it. And they even went so far to tell the individual who had their lives in his hands, metaphorically, he thought, that even if God does not save us, be it known to you, we will not worship your God. That is spiritual maturity at its finest. You know, they acted in a correctly courageous manner, but they were cautious even with their words. They invoked God into the conversation. They didn't say well, you're just a filthy, evil, pagan, devil, idol-worshiping idiot. I'm not doing it. That's not the language they used. No, they had bridled their passion. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. When Jesus was speaking to his disciples, he gives, I think, a very powerful message here in Luke chapter 12. And perhaps it's a message that you haven't really thought of. When he's speaking of being ready, he says, blessed are those slaves or servants whom the master will find on alert when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself to serve and will have them recline at the table and will come up and wait on them. Whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third, and finds them so blessed are those servants. He says in verse 39, But be sure of this, that if the head of the house, who had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. You too be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. And I think we've oftentimes looked at that and considered the realization that people who tell you they know exactly when Jesus Christ are coming are in direct contradiction to that statement right there. And perhaps in your own mind, if you think you know when he's coming, you're probably wrong in your own mind through self-deception, because he's coming at an hour and a time that you don't think. And he's giving a word of caution to his disciples. Be cautious as time goes on. Be careful as time goes on. Let's turn over to John chapter 7. John chapter 7. I think in John chapter 7, in my opinion, Jesus is saying the words in Luke 12, but then walking the talk, so to speak, in John 7. John 7, verse 1, he says, "And after these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him." Think about what you just read right there. Here you have an individual who is the Son of God, who even told Pilate that if this was his world, he could call down legions of angels. Why would he choose at this time to not go through Galilee because they were seeking to kill him? He was cautious. He wasn't being foolish. He wasn't being so bold in an area for which he was trying to demonstrate for his disciples. Walk cautiously when people are trying to kill you. Be careful. He truly didn't have to be worried about it ultimately, but he set an example of being cautious. Let's also look at chapter 11, verse 54. Chapter 11, verse 54. "Therefore Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews." Do you think he was afraid of the Jews? "But he went away from there to the country near the wilderness into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples." He was demonstrating for his disciples there's a time to be bold, there's a time to be cautious. When trouble is there, as we read in Proverbs, you hide yourself. You don't put yourself in harm's way. Unnecessary risks. And I think that is what we're seeing right here, and I think that is something where you and I can learn greatly from. If we were permitted to go into an area in a wrong direction because of our unrestrained risk, we enter into the example of Daniel 4, which was Nebuchadnezzar. You think about what he did. He tried to be so bold, and what happened to him? He became like an animal. It's like God took out a computer chip that made him a human and put in that of a bird, and he was a walking animal because of his passion, because of his boldness. And one would think, if the chronology of Daniel is accurate, with what he saw experienced in Daniel 1, why would he be so bold in Daniel 4? Unrestrained, boldness. Now, I hope we're not that way, but there's a lesson for you, there's a lesson for me, that even being bold and courageous Christians, we have to balance that out with unnecessary risks, being cautious at the right time. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 21. In the wrong chapter. No wonder that didn't look right. We see here that Peter came and said to him, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him up to 7 times? And Jesus said, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves or servants. And when he began to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents, large sum of money, was brought to him. But since he did not have the means to repay, the Lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. So the slave or the servant fell to his ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, "Have patience with me, I will repay you everything." And the Lord of that slave or servant felt compassion and released him and forgave him of his debt. But that very servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount, 100 denarii, and he seized him and began to choke him, saying, "Pay back what you owe." So that his fellow servant fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, "Have patience with me, I will repay you." But he was unwilling, and he went and he threw him into prison until he should pay back what he owed, which is obviously never going to happen because you can't make money when you're in jail to even pay back. So when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved, and they came and reported to the Lord all that had happened. And then summoning him, his Lord, he said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant in the same way that I had mercy on you?" And his Lord was moved with anger and handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that he owed him. My heavenly Father will do also to the same to you if you do not forgive your brothers from your heart. And what we're seeing here is we cannot allow our passion, even our boldness, when one has harmed you in a wrong way, to overshadow humanity that we should have for others. Sometimes that can be hard. And I will say this, there are some people that have been harmed in this world that I don't understand how, outside of God, perhaps removing something out of their memory that they can never get past. I'm talking about things in society that have been done to people. I don't understand how that can be. I just hope that with some of the more moderate, minimal things that have happened to me in my life, what I see there is unrestrained passion can get me into a world of problems with God, even with the small things I've gone through. I mean, when I think of the rape, I think of the abuse, I think of the beatings, I think of the things that some people have endured and gone through in this life. I don't know how they can get past these things. I personally think God will have to erase some of these things from people's minds. But that's just a theory. That's just a thought. My point that I'm driving to is we cannot allow unrestrained passion to cause us. We need to stop, even in moments when we've been wronged. Think before you speak. Think before you act. Be bold in the right ways, but also be cautious in the right ways. And I think that as we conclude here, when we consider the application of being the cautious Christian, it's a thoughtful balance between being courageous and cautious. You may ask yourself, how do I exhibit cautiousness in my daily life? Am I a foolish person? Am I so bold that I don't see the consequences? You know, how can I, or what can I do rather, to develop a better willingness to be careful with the decisions and opportunities that come to me? What blocks the cautiousness from working in me, from being exhibited in me? Do I stop it? Should I remove that obstacle so that I can be cautious? In other words, being impetuous, having a short fuse. How can I make cautiousness a function better, stronger, faster, even during distress and uncertainty? We can look at that in our physical lives, our fiscal lives, but I'm thinking we need to look at it in our spiritual lives as well.